Hello and most welcome to 1223 of the series. We will today talk about the implications of liberating the self or uniting the self. In Newtonian classical physics, there is hardly any room for a self, identification, awareness. All those things seems to be distant, non-reachable, out of lacking space enough to be existing. Whereas in quantum physics, consciousness is a possibility and a free will is a possibility. It's a possibility which is important to understand. It's not a fact. Most people, consciousness is simply not present. They cannot collapse the wave function in any desirable way. Therefore, the classical world is their world. It is out of reach to affect. So it is not like there are two different worldviews. There are two different realities. Living in the classical world means that you don't have a choice. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any reason for classical world where there is no choice, where there is no options, where there are no alternatives. Quantum physics is the establishment of alternatives. It is the understanding of the possibility of alternatives, and it's also the development of alternatives. It is most definitely not something freely given. It is not an inborn trait in us to have a free will. Consciousness is today very rare. Most of the population is, according to Yuri Havel and Simon Neil, unconscious robots, mimicking the ideology they found their beliefs in. The idea that human beings are nothing but some sort of computational machine. They do embody that. They do that. Having no free will whatsoever, which is the most common in the population, maybe 98 to 99% of the population. They are wholly or partly fully automated, non-free will machines. I will continue on page 4 or 486 as it appears in the special issue Ethnography, Physical Culture of December 2008. Non-doing then is still a somatic mode of attention. Attention is paid to and with the body by inhibiting reaction and habit. As non-doing is attentive, it is also active. It is, as the quote above indicates, very different than doing nothing. It is a particular kind of work on and through the body / self to promote good alignment. As Alexander wrote, to try and get it right by direct doing is to try and reproduce what is known and cannot lead to the right, the as yet unknown. For Alexander, the body does not know good use of the self instinctively. Rather, it comes about through practice and under the guidance of an Alexander teacher whose own use of themselves is good. The fact that the Alexander teacher must demonstrate good use in order to transmit it to the pupil was emphasized by my own teacher and by others I interviewed. In non-doing, reactions which are perceived to interfere with the self are inhibited, which is then thought to allow the right thing to do itself. It is here that the idea of re-education begins to be apparent. By non-doing, aspects of the body/self in its proper alignment asserts itself. Alexander's self is in no way preconscious. He speaks of freeing humanity from the domination of instinctive habit and the slavery of the associated automatic manner of reaction. What the work seeks to cultivate is a perpetual conscious awareness, although this is problematic, as I shall later discuss. End gaining and means whereby. In everyday action, Alexander felt that most people's use of self was what he called end gaining. End gaining refers to seeking out an aim or an objective without considering the process by which it is to be obtained. On the other hand, Alexander referred to careful consideration of this process as the means whereby. One of the key aims of the Alexander technique, then, is to develop an awareness of the means whereby actions are carried out. It is a privileging of process over result. In one lesson, my Alexander teacher demonstrated the principle of means whereby with an exercise where the first finger of each hand drew a circle, each in opposite direction. With elbows bent and extended and these fingers facing each other, he asked me to draw opposite circles with each finger so that they would end up back at the top of the circle at the same time. This exercise in hand coordination was too difficult and I was unable to reproduce what he had demonstrated. Instead, therefore, he broke the exercise down to demonstrate the means whereby it could be achieved. By splitting the circle into quadrants and taking the exercise slowly with an awareness of where the finger should be after drawing each quadrant, it became easier to reproduce. If the fingers start at the top of the circle, they should meet each other at both the top and bottom points. At each side, they should be directly opposite one another. This could then speed up or broken down further. My Alexander teacher explained that the process did not have to be examined more carefully if the results seemed acceptable. If you're getting what you want, it's fine for the time being. However, like any action, it might later require further refining, thus pointing to the ongoing nature of the work. While conscious control may be achieved, bodily knowledge is always in danger of receding into the background and becoming habitual. Refinement of what one wants from an activity and repeating it in order to achieve something new is one way of ensuring that it remains in the foreground of consciousness. Good use of the self. As mentioned above, Alexander referred throughout his work to the cultivation of good use of the self. This relates to the proper alignment of the head, neck, back relationship, which, by virtue of being regarded as the primarily control, will bring the rest of the body into good alignment as well. Alexander's teachers are particularly interested in the means whereby good use of the self is achieved. This is because such use is an ongoing process and not a state to be definitely reached. Throughout the first 10 lessons in particular, I notice a number of gradual changes occurring. In the first full lesson after the introductory workshop, I noted in my field journal that I left feeling wider and as if there were less weights in each of my limbs. By the second lesson, however, I felt less wide, less realigned, yet my teacher noted that my alignment was better already and that I was arching my mid-back less. During the third lesson, I was beginning to notice it was becoming easier to stand up straight. And by the fourth lesson, I felt as if my body had changed so significantly that I began to wonder whether I made many of these changes subconsciously on my way to the lessons in preparation. A standard Alexander technique exercise, that on working on alignment while sitting and standing from a chair and trying to maintain a good head-neck-back relationship, as I did so, seemed easier, and I found that I was seated further back on the chair when I sat, which my teacher described as a better position. Despite seeming easier, the work also became more tiring. After the 6th, 7th and 8th lessons, I found myself going home to sleep, and my teacher explained that this is very tiring work. It is tiring because it is very new things to do, and the system of the body changes when we accept new things. Muscles often hurt the day after a lesson as well, especially thigh muscles, if we had done a lot of sitting and standing work with the chair. My teacher told me that this is very normal, and that he also sometimes experienced this after a lesson with another teacher. As lessons progressed, I needed few books to support my head during table work sessions. At the end of the lesson, indicated changes in how I carried my head and neck, and that I was on some level applying the oft-repeated directions to allow the head to go forward and up. I also noticed a significant change in my shoulders, which became less rounded and sloped. Often, however, these changes took me by surprise, and I could not fully chronicle their development. There was no steady process through which I noticed the alignment of my shoulders shifting. Rather, one morning I looked in the mirror and noticed that a change that I had for years been attempting to effect was something I was now doing, and that it seemed effortless. Habit and conscious control. Bodily knowledge is often unconscious knowledge, and the issue that arises is how quickly conscious awareness becomes unconscious. While there were moments when I became abruptly aware that something I had been doing was now changing, the process was often so subtle that I seemed to miss it, despite trying to constantly attend to and document this process through my field notes. Bodily habits, once they become habitual, cease to be conscious. This is the problem at the heart of what Bourdieu outlines in the passage cited at the beginning of this article. Social science struggles to understand how such bodily learning takes place, precisely because once it is learned, it generally slips from conscious awareness. In Alexander technique, however, conscious control is always desirable. Since there is no fixed endpoint when the work is over and good use of the self is obtained, it is usually ongoing. It is not that activities do not eventually become habitual in Alexander technique, but that there is a constant drive to have conscious awareness of them. Where Alexander technique differs from other forms of bodily re-education, such as Feldenkrais work, is not in habit but in the desire for perpetual conscious control. The nervous system is never perceived as capable of taking over the work fully. The body's own knowledge is considered to be largely end-gaining and lacking in the awareness needed to consider the means whereby an action is accomplished. The qualities described above, non-doing, means whereby, and the use of the self through inhibition of reactions and habitual responses are the characteristics of the Alexander technique as a somatic mode of attention. However, while all somatic modes of attention require awareness of the embodied self, it is not the case that they all require the kind of conscious awareness developed in the Alexander technique. Further, in many of the somatic modes of attention mentioned by Chordas, such as athletics or dieting, the emphasis is larger on what Alexander technique would call end gaining. As Chordas notes, following Marcel Mauss, there is what we are calling a somatic mode of attention associated with the acquisition of any technique of the body. But this mode of attention recedes into the horizon once the technique is mastered. Alexander technique, on the other hand, continues to require somatic modes of attention, no matter how long one has been doing it. By examining what is involved in a particular somatic mode of attention, the process by which it works also becomes evident. Through the discussion above, the psychophysical practices I have described in relation to Alexander technique give a good sense of how the technique works and how it achieves the aim of good use of the self through exercises which aim at conscious control and inhibition and a focus on maintaining a good head-neck-back relationship. Previously, I raised the issue whether the body could itself be made conscious through the process of inhibition, a question with significant implications for Alexander technique's claim to be holistic. If conscious control is exercised by the mind over a passive body, then although the technique incorporates both body and mind, it does not challenge the dualistic assertion of mental supremacy, nor overcome the body-mind distinction. Yet, what is apparent in these discussions about non-doing, means whereby, and the use of the self, is the assertion that it is the self which is worked on as an attempt to do away with dualism. Further, as the importance of the head-neck-back relationship in primary control shows, this self is understood to be firmly located in the body through consciousness and is not separated from it. Good or bad use of the self is defined not simply by the positioning of the head, neck and back, but by the degree of conscious control which is exercised over their relationship. Alexander's notion of self clearly privileges conscious awareness and control over unreflective use, but this consciousness is a hallmark of the self which is firmly bound up in the body. This is not to say that Alexander technique entirely overcomes the dualistic separation of mind and body, since it continues to emphasize the kind of conscious awareness we generally associate with mind, but it does problematize it by invoking a particular relationship of the body as central to the self. Examining the somatic modes of attention involved in the Alexander technique is appropriately a way of examining the means whereby it obtains its goals rather than the ends it seeks. By bringing bodily habits into conscious awareness, the technique provides insight into the process by which it becomes possible to understand with the body in Bourdieu's sense. What the foregoing discussion makes clear is that Alexander technique is a culturally constituted and elaborated way of changing the self, with a set of practices associated with particular principles through which the technique is articulated. These practices seek to change not only the habits of an individual, but also his or her habitus, resulting in more significant personal and potentially culture changes. Habitus. Bourdieu's theory of habitus provides a way of accounting for the unconscious reproduction of social structures and conditions through the embodied dispositions of actors. What Alexander technique seeks ultimately to change is not simply bad habitual use of the self, but habitus. However, for Bourdieu, as I have said, the habitus is largely unconscious, whereas in Alexander technique, the new habitus is explicitly guided by conscious control. This is a tension, but not an unsurmountable one. As I have said, actions repeated in the Alexander technique also become habitual, and the emphasis on constant attention and awareness to these habits does not, in the last instance, stop them from becoming integrated into the habitus in an unconscious way. However, the new habitus cultivated through Alexander technique certainly differs from the old one inasmuch as it is dominated by conscious awareness rather than unconscious behavior. through developing awareness of the body self and inhibiting initial reactions, the old habitus, choices of behavior are widened, bringing about the opportunity for individuals to react in new ways. Bourdieu too notes that in certain situations and amongst certain groups of people, habitus may sometimes be a matter of conscious maintenance. It is likely that those who are in the right place in the social world can abandon or entrust themselves more and more completely to their disposition. This is the ease of the well-born, than those who occupy awkward positions such as the parvenus and the déclassé, and the latter are more likely to bring to consciousness that which for others is taken for granted, because they are forced to keep watch on themselves and consciously correct for the first movement of a habitus that generates inappropriate or misplaced behaviors. To a certain extent, this holds true for those involved in the Alexander technique, who must keep watch on themselves and consciously inhabit all first movement in order to decide whether or not they are appropriate to a given situation. In so doing, they are ultimately concerned with providing participants with choice rather than simply teaching them to stand up straight. Bourdieu claims that habitus is largely durable, although he qualifies that it is not fate. Being the product of history, it is an open system of dispositions that is constantly subjected to experiences, and therefore constantly affected by them in a way that either reinforces or modifies its structures. It is durable but not eternal. He later suggests that habitus is constantly being revised, although never radically, because this process of revision always works on the premises of the previously established state. However, in Alexander technique, the processes of inhibition and conscious control of ceasing to do what was done before and then consciously intervening in the action one was planning to do may be a more radical revision of the habitus than Bourdieu imagined possible, given that such a state of inhibition and conscious awareness is intended to be perpetual. So the point is to be taken here is that Newtonian classical notions are being unconscious of space and time, of reality, or rather that there are different points of reference, different reference frames. And when you choose reference frames, that action is consciousness. It is not first consciousness that chooses reference frames. No, it is the choosing and the different reference frames that are or is consciousness. And with a one reference frame, which is randomly chosen, not shared by others, which is the case in Newtonian physics, because no attention is paid to the reference frames or the ordinality versus cardinality of things. Therefore, that reinforces unawareness. So Newtonian classics is not an ideology. It's for common people, not a physics. It has nothing to do with physics. It's the unawareness of things, unawareness of being, of the thinginess of the world, not understanding locatedness, not understanding direction, not having space. Instead, there are blank spots, dark spots of unconsciousness. Newtonian classical physics is nothing but that. It's a blockage. All of Newtonian physics is included in quantum physics. Everything can be derived from quantum physics. Everything can be fully and 100% understood from quantum physics. But nothing of quantum physics can be understood from Newtonian mechanics. Nothing. So it's a relationship that is not equal. And that is very important to remember. And thinking that Newtonian ideology is sort of a paradigm, as Thomas Kuhn had it taken to be, is absolutely wrong. Feyerabend was absolutely right in rejecting Kuhn, although he was his teacher, his grandmaster at some point, but Kuhn had no idea. Equalizing the paradigms is first, taking a perspective from nowhere, or a God's perspective, whatever you want. Second, it's putting them on an equal level, that there is no change in awareness, directionality, or sense of reality being experienced more, thereby making everything completely abstract and transcendental or nonsensical. Feyerabend had it in the end called Thomas Kuhn only boring, which really serves the point. A tragic destiny for a great thinker who went into more and more of narrow bodily sensation, which is important. He became slouched, doubled up. He didn't look healthy, took up a Searlean perspective of the world, and he lost all sense of reality. I think this is a good point to round up. I say thank you very much. It's a pleasure having you as usual, and bye-bye for now.